Step the boy aside, we need that place. The man who said it did not look at my son when he said it. He looked at the guard, the tall sentry in the scarlet tunic who stood at the head of the rope where I had set Davin's small chair an hour before dawn, where I had been promised, in writing, in 3 different hands, that my son would stand. The man's voice was the kind that has never once in its life been told no, and so it had grown thin and certain, the way a road grows smooth where only the heavy carriages pass. He flicked 2 gloved fingers toward the chair without turning his head, as if my son were a stack of folded cloth left in the wrong room. "Did you hear me?" he said. "It was not a question. Move him. I am Davin's mother. My name does not matter, and I have come to think that is the whole point of it, that the people who matter least to the great houses are the ones the great houses are supposed to be for. I will tell you what I saw at the Lantern Court of Maldering on the morning of the founding, because I was 8 feet from it, holding the rail of an empty wheelchair with both hands so no one would see them shake, and because the man in the scarlet tunic did a thing that morning I have not in 5 years found the bottom of. He did not move my son. You should understand first what the place was, because the man who came to take it understood its worth better than I did, and that is why he wanted it. Maldering is the old winter seat of the House of Caraway, a low gray palace above the river, with a court of pale stone the kingdom calls the Lantern Court, because on the founding morning they hang it with 1,000 small glass lamps, and the new lord walks its length from the chapel to the river gate to take the old oath in the open air, where the common people can see it done. It is the one morning of the year the rope comes down to within an arm's reach of ordinary folk. Most years I would not have dreamed of bringing Davin. The crowds are deep, the morning is cold, and my son is not strong. He was born with a heart that does its work slowly and against the grain. The long winter had been hard on him, and the doctors at the river hospice had begun to speak to me in the careful, level voices doctors use when they are trying to make a hard thing sound like an ordinary thing. But in the autumn the mistress of the almonry, a stout, plain woman named Edry Fenn who ran the house's charity school and visited the hospice on the cold days, had sat by Davin's cot and listened to him tell her that the only thing in all the world he wished to see was the lamp walk on the founding morning, the Lord going by close enough to touch the cold off his cloak. He had a picture of it, cut from an almanac, pinned over his cot. He had memorized the order of it, that the 3rd lamp from the chapel was where the Lord paused to face the river, that the oldest guardsman in the house held the river gate, and that at the head of the rope by the 3rd lamp you would be the first common face the new Lord saw when he turned. Edry Fenn did not promise gently and forget, the way kind people do. She made it real. She had the understeward write it into the order of the morning in his own hand, a place at the head of the rope by the 3rd lamp for the hospice boy and his mother, with a chair set and a household man told off to see he came to no harm, and she had the almonry seal struck on it. She brought me the paper folded small and said, "Keep this. If anyone troubles you on the morning, you show them this, and you send for me." I kept it in the breast of my coat for 11 weeks. I thought a sealed paper from the house was the end of a thing. I have learned since that for the small people a sealed paper is only the beginning, that the real promise is never the seal, but whether, when the powerful want your place, there is a man between you and them who will not move. There was. His name, I learned afterward, was Aldous Wren, and he had stood the river gate at Maldering for 31 years, which made him the oldest guardsman in the house. And so, by the very tradition my son had memorized off an almanac, the man who would hold the river gate on the founding morning and stand nearest the new Lord when he turned. He was at the head of the rope when we came in the dark. I had brought Davin by the long side ramp, so early the lamps were not yet lit and the stone breathed cold up through the chair's thin wheels, because he could not bear the crowds and I wanted him settled and warm before the press began. The guardsman was already at his post and did not greet us. Guardsmen at their posts greet no one. But when I lifted Davin from the chair to the small seat by the 3rd lamp, he weighed almost nothing by then, my boy. He weighed like a coat full of birds. The guardsman's eyes came down for one breath, off the river gate and onto my son's face, then went back up to the gate. I thought nothing of it. I have thought a great deal about it since. Davin was happy. I should put that on the page before anything else, because so much of what followed was cold, and I do not want the cold to be the only thing you carry away. My son sat in the dark by the third lamp with a blanket to his chin, and his breath going up white, as happy as I had seen him in a year. He named the lamps as the lamplighters lit them, and he was right about the third, the tallest, on its own iron standard where the pavement made a wide pale circle, and when its flame caught, the whole circle glowed warm, and Davin laughed out loud, a small cracked laugh, and said, "Mother, we are in the middle of the light." We were. Edry Fenn had not given him a place at the edge of the morning. She had given him the heart of it. The court filled as the sky grayed. The rope filled behind us and beside us, common folk pressing in good-humored against the cold. A choir above the chapel began the slow founding hymn, and Davin did not take his eyes from the chapel door at the far end. The household man told off to mind us, a young footman named Pell, scarcely more than a boy himself, stood at Davin's shoulder and pointed things out to him, and I let myself believe, for a half-hour, that the hard part was the bringing of him here, and the rest of the morning would simply happen the way the almanac said. Then the carriages came up the river road, and the great people began to arrive, and one of them wanted the third lamp. I did not understand at first who he was. He came down the cleared lane with 2 men behind him and a household officer hurrying at his side, dressed very fine and very dark, and he walked the way men walk when they have decided in advance that everything in their path will give way, without the small adjustments the rest of us make for one another, so that the officer beside him was doing all the giving way for both of them. He stopped at the wide pale circle of the third lamp and looked at it the way a man looks at a good seat in an empty theater, then at the rope, then at my son in the small chair in the middle of the light, and a small line came between his brows as though he had found a fault in the workmanship of the morning. "This is the turning place," he said to the officer, not to me, "the third lamp. He'll face us here." He had a soft, dry voice, and the cold did not seem to reach him. "I'll stand here." The officer said something low and unhappy that I could not hear. The great man's line deepened. "Then move them," he said. And that was when he flicked his 2 gloved fingers at my son, and said the thing I began this account with, stepped the boy aside. "We need that place," and looked, while he said it, not at Davin and not at me, but at the guardsman at the head of the rope, because some part of him understood the true shape of the room. That the guardsman was the thing that would either move or not move, and my son and I were only what stood behind him, and would follow wherever he went. The guardsman did not go anywhere. I should tell you what I did, because it is the truth. I reached into my coat for Edry Fenn's folded paper, my hands shaking so I could not at once find the fold, and I heard myself saying, too high and too fast, "We have a place, sir. We were given a place, it's sealed, it's by the almonry." And the great man let his eyes come to me at last, the way you glance at a dog that has barked, and said, "I'm sure you do," in a voice that meant the paper did not exist, that papers were what people like me had instead of power, and that he was not going to spend a cold morning being shown a sealed scrap by a hospice woman with a sick child in the middle of his turning place. "Officer," he said, "have your man move the chair." The officer turned to the guardsman. I saw the officer's face, and I have been sorry for him since. He was a household man caught between a paper he half remembered and a personage he could not afford to anger, and his whole body was an apology pointed in 2 directions at once. "Wren," he said, that was the first time I heard the guardsman's name. "The gentleman is a guest of the house. Stand the boy down to the side rope. There's a place at the side rope." There was. The side rope was a fine place. From it you could see the Lord go by at perhaps 30 feet, which is more than most people see in a life, and a sensible woman with a sick son and a sealed paper. Great men laughed it might have wheeled Davin quietly to the side rope and counted herself fortunate. I want you to know I was already half decided to do it. I had the chair's rail in my hands. I was already turning it. Because that is what we do, the small people. We have learned the sealed paper is for show, and that when the powerful want your place, the place was never really yours. It was the guardsman who taught me otherwise, and he did it without moving and without saying one word. The officer had given him an order, stand the boy down to the side rope, and the guardsman did not obey it. He did not refuse it either, not in any way the great man could point to and call insolence. He simply stood. He stood the way the river gate had taught him to stand for 31 years, eyes forward, rifle at his shoulder, the cold light running along the brass of his buttons, and he did not put a hand toward my son's chair, and he did not so much as turn his head toward the side rope, and the small motion that the officer's order required of him. One step, one gloved hand on the chair's rail, the easiest thing in the world, did not happen. The order fell on him and ran off him like rain off slate, and he stayed exactly where the head of the rope and the third lamp and my son were. I have wondered since how a man learns to do that, to disobey by holding still so completely. The disobedience cannot be named. A guardsman's whole art is in what he will not do. They drill him for years not to flinch when he is spat at, not to look when he is taunted, not to move when the crowd surges. The great man had spent his life among people whose training was the opposite, to move the instant the powerful wished it. He had never met the other kind of trained man, and he did not know how to make such a man move, because everything he knew about making people move depended on their wanting somewhere to be moved. The guardsman did not want anything the great man had. He didn't hear you, the great man said to the officer, mild, almost amused. Tell him again. Ren, the officer's voice cracked on it, move the chair. That's an order, man. And here the guardsman did the only thing he did with his body in that whole long moment, and it was so small that I think I am one of the few people in the court who saw it. He turned his eyes, only his eyes, not his head. The head stayed forward over the river gate. He turned his eyes down and sideways, the way he had when we first came in the dark, and he looked at my son. He looked at Davin for the length of one breath. And Davin, who had gone very still and very white when the great man came, who had understood before I did that the morning was about to be taken from him, the way mornings had always been taken from him, looked back up at the guardsman, and something passed between them that did not pass through me, though I was holding my son's hand the whole time. Then the guardsman's eyes went back up to the river gate, and he spoke. It was the first time he had spoken, and it would be very nearly the last, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not look at the great man when he said it. The place is the boy's, he said. The house gave it, I keep the house's word at this gate, that is the post. That was all. He did not argue the paper, did not appeal to anyone's better nature, did not explain that my son was sick or that we were poor. None of the things a kind man uses to soften the powerful, because he was not trying to soften the powerful. He was stating a fact about the post he stood. The house had given its word at this gate. To move my son was to break it, and he would not break it, because keeping it was the post, and a guardsman does not abandon his post. That not pity, not kindness, was the whole of his answer. I understood in that moment that I had been wrong about the sealed paper. It was not for show. It was a word the house had given. And there are men whose entire life is built so that a word, once given, has somewhere a man standing in front of it who will not be moved off it. Edry Fenn had not merely written my son into the order of the morning. She had placed him behind Aldous Wren, had known that a seal is only paper unless there is a man at the gate, and known who held the gate, and given my son to the oldest and most immovable man in the house, and called it a place at the rope. The great man understood it too, and it made him, for the first time, angry. Officer, he said, and the mildness was gone, do you know who I am? My lord, the officer began. Do you know who I am? The great man said again, not loud, and the second time it was not for the officer at all. It was for the whole court. a man laying the weight of his name down on the stone where everyone could feel how heavy it was. And it was heavy. He was a great creditor of the house, not of its blood but of its purse, a man to whom the house of Caraway owed a debt so large it was, in plain truth, the reason the new lord could take the oath that morning at all. He had bought the morning, in a sense, paid for the lamps and the choir by lending the silver that kept the house standing, and come up the river road to stand in the heart of the light and have the new lord turn and see him first. The silver was real, and the debt was real, and against the debt my son had a folded paper and a sick heart and a guardsman who would not move. I have lent this house, the great man said slowly so that each word landed, more than it can ever repay. Tomorrow, if I choose, I can call that debt, and there will be no house here for this man to guard, and he will not move a chair. He let it sit. Then to the guardsman directly for the first time, "You, statue, you stand at the sufferance of my money. Move the boy, or I will have the post you love so much, and 20 posts beside it, and there will be nothing left at this gate for you to keep your precious word at." And the guardsman said nothing, because there was nothing in that worth answering, and he did not move. But I saw the household men along the rope go still in a new way, not the trained stillness of the guardsmen, but the stillness of men who have just heard something said aloud that should never be said aloud. The threat to pull down the house spoken in the house's own court, on the house's own morning, over a sick boy's chair. I saw the young footman Pell go white to the lips. I saw the officer close his eyes as if he had been struck. The great man, reaching for the largest weapon he had reached past the thing that would have worked a quiet word, a coin, and instead, in his anger, threatened the whole house out loud in front of the whole house, which is a different thing, and which a house, if it is a house at all, cannot let stand. He had made it, without meaning to, no longer a quarrel about a chair. He had made it a question the house would have to answer in front of everyone, whether the house of Caraway kept its word at its own gate, or whether its word could be bought back by the man who held its debt. The house began to answer. It did not answer the way the great man expected, which was the whole of his mistake. He had spent his life in rooms where the answer to a name like his was a hurried, frightened compliance, and he stood now waiting for that compliance to arrive, for the officer to crumple, for the chair to be wheeled aside, for the morning to bend the way mornings bent for him. He waited for fear. And the house did feel fear. I will not pretend the household men were not afraid of him. But fear was not what moved first. What moved first was the young footman Pell, who was not afraid enough to be wise. Pell stepped out from Davin's shoulder and went, not to the great man, not to the officer, but at a half-run across the cleared lane and up the chapel steps and in through the side door, and he was gone perhaps 90 seconds, and the great man watched him go with the contempt of a man who thinks a servant has run away. Pell had not run away. He had gone to fetch the only weapon the small people in that court had, which was the truth, told to the right person fast. The right person came out of the chapel door at a walk that was almost a run, with her skirts caught up in one fist and the almonry seal chain swinging at her breast. And it was Edry Fenn, the mistress of the almonry, the stout plain woman who had sat by my son's cot in the autumn and made him a promise and made it real with a seal. She came down the chapel steps and across the lane, and she did not slow when she reached the great man. She went past him to my son, and she put her hand on Davin's blanketed shoulder, and only then did she turn and look at the man who had come to take his place. "My Lord Hask," she said, so that was his name, Hask the creditor, "you are standing on my charge." "I am standing where I please," he said. "I have told this man to move the boy. He will not." "You may move him yourself, madam, if you've a use for him, but he is leaving the third lamp." "He is not," said Edry Fenn. "I gave him that place under the almonry seal 11 weeks ago before you ever sent word you were coming. The order of the morning is sealed and lodged. It cannot be unsealed for your comfort. And if it could," she lifted her chin, and her voice carried now, because she had stopped speaking to him and begun speaking to the court, the way he had, "if it could, I would not, because this child is the reason for the mourning, and you are merely the man who paid for the lamps." I heard the rope murmur at that. Edry Fenn had spent her life among the small people of the river quarter, and she knew the temper of a crowd the way the guardsman knew the temper of a gate. The common folk had come to see the founding, the old promise of the house renewed in the open air, and they were watching now a rich man try to take a sick boy's place in the heart of the light, and they did not like it, and Edry Fenn had simply named aloud the thing they were already feeling, and the murmur swelled. Lord Hask was not a fool. He heard the crowd turn and he changed his ground. The order of the morning can be amended by the steward of the house, he said. Where is the steward? I'll have this settled by a man with the authority to settle it, not by an almoner and a statue. And this was cleverer. The steward was the great man's natural ally, an officer of the purse who knew to the last coin what the house owed Lord Hask, and who could be relied upon to understand which way the morning had to fall. They sent for the steward, and while we waited for him, while the choir went on overhead, oblivious, and the lamps burned, and my son sat very small and very straight in his chair and held my hand so hard it hurt, I watched the thing that I have come to think of as the real heart of that morning, which is the thing the title of any story like this never quite catches. I watched the house decide what it was. Because the steward came, and he was exactly the man Lord Hask had counted on, a lean, gray, careful officer named Corwin Vale, come down the lane already knowing the shape of the trouble Pell had not fetched him. Lord Hask's own man had, to make it go away in the great man's favor, with the least possible noise. He looked at the chair, at the great man, at the guardsman who would not move it, and I saw him do the sum in his head, and it came out the way sums always came out for Lord Hask. The debt was real, the boy was one boy, the morning would be over by noon, and a wise house does not anger the man who holds its life in his ledger over a chair. Mistress Fenn, the steward said gently, I think we can find the boy a very fine place at. Read the order, said the guardsman. It was the second time Aldous Wren had spoken, and the court went quiet for it, because a guardsman speaking twice in one morning was a thing no one there had seen. He still did not turn his head. He spoke to the river gate, and the words went out over all of us. The order of the morning is sealed and lodged, he said. I stand the river gate by the order of the morning. If the order says the boy stands at the third lamp, the boy stands at the third lamp, and I keep him there, and no word from any man living moves him but a new order, sealed and lodged, unsealing the old. That is the law of the post. Read the order, steward. Then we will all know what the post requires, and I will do it, as I have done it for 31 years. He had done a thing there that I did not fully understand until later. He had taken the quarrel out of the realm of power, where Lord Hask was strong and my son was nothing, and put it back into the realm of law, the dry written law of the house's own order of ceremony, where a sealed order outranks a living man's wish, because that is the only way a house can be trusted to keep any word at all. He had made the steward's clever solution impossible. The steward could not find the boy a very fine place, by a kind word, because the guardsman had declared, in front of the whole court, that only a new sealed order could move the old one. And now if the steward simply waved my son to the side rope to please Lord Hask, he would be doing it in the teeth of the law of the morning, in front of the rope, on the record. The steward Vale was a careful man, and careful men hate to act against the record. He looked at the guardsman a long moment, and I watched the sum redo itself behind his gray eyes, and this time it came out differently, because the guardsman had changed the figures. The debt was still real. But now on the other side of the sum, there was the law of the morning named aloud, the rope murmuring, the choir singing the old promise of the house overhead, and the plain fact which a careful officer cannot unsee once it is named, that if the house of Caraway broke its own sealed word at its own gate on its own founding morning to please the man who held its debt, then it was not a house at all any more. It was only a property of Lord Hask's, dressed up in lamps. And a steward, even a frightened one, does not want to be the man who hands the house over. Send to the muniment room, said the steward at last, for the order of the morning. We will read it here. Lord Hask understood that he had lost the ground, and he did the thing such men do when the ground goes. He raised the stakes past the quarrel itself, to break the will of the people in front of him by sheer cost. If that order is read, he said very quietly to the steward, but not so quietly that I could not hear, and one syllable of it keeps that boy where I have said I will stand, then I call the dead at noon. Today, you understand me, Vale, not a threat, a promise. Keep the boy, lose the house. And he smiled finally for the first time, a small dry smile, because he believed that no man, faced plainly with the choice between a sick stranger's child and the roof over his own head and the heads of everyone he served, would choose the child. He had never met Aldous Wren, and he did not yet understand that he had also, that morning, never met the house of Caraway, the real one, the one that is not the ledger and not the Lord's blood and not the lamps, but the thing that lives in the men and women who keep its word at its gates, and that he was about to. The order came from the muniment room in the hands of an old archivist who walked as fast as his legs would carry him. A long roll of parchment with the almonry seal, and the house seal both pressed into the wax at its foot, and the steward Vale knelt and unrolled it on the cold stone of the lamp circle, and read it out in his dry, careful voice. And it was just as Edry Fenn had said. A place at the head of the rope by the third lamp, for the hospice child and his mother, with a chair set and a household man told off, by order of the mistress of the almonry, sealed and lodged 11 weeks before the morning. It named my son. The steward read his name aloud in the heart of the light, and I heard Davin make a small sound beside me, because he had never heard his name read out as though it belonged among the great matters of a great house, and there it was sealed, lodged, lawful, his. The steward rolled the order back up. He stood. He looked at Lord Hask, and he looked at the boy, and the whole court waited to see which way the careful gray man would fall, with the debt on one side of his sum and the law of the morning on the other, and Lord Hask's promise, keep the boy, lose the house, sitting over all of it like a held breath. And it was at exactly that moment, before the steward could speak, that the chapel bell rang the hour of the oath, and the great doors at the far end of the court swung open, and the new lord of the house of Caraway came out to walk the lamp walk. He was young, perhaps 30, in the dark plain coat the new lord wears before the oath, bareheaded in the cold, and he came out into the murmur and the pressed crowd and the unmistakable wrongness of a morning that had stopped where it should have been moving, and he checked on the chapel steps and took it in. He saw the steward kneeling with the order. He saw the great creditor of his house standing in the lamp circle where the new lord was meant to turn. He saw the guardsman at the river gate, immovable. And he saw, in the heart of the light, a sick child in a chair and his mother with both hands white on the rail, and an officer's whole face begging him to make the trouble disappear. A lesser man, a man more like Lord Hask, would have walked down the lamp walk and let the trouble be settled quietly behind him. The boy moved, the morning saved, the debt unprovoked, and called it wisdom. I have thought many times since how easily the morning could have gone that way, and how the difference was one young man's understanding, in the space of 3 steps down a chapel stair, of what the oath he was about to take actually meant. Because the founding oath of the house of Caraway, I did not know this then. I know it now, is not an oath to defend the house's lands or its blood or its purse. It is older and plainer than that. The new lord swears, in the open air where the common people can witness it, that he will keep the word of the house to the least of those it is given to, before the great, against the great, though it cost him. That is the whole reason the rope comes down to within an arm's reach of ordinary folk, so the least of them can see the Lord swear it, and so the Lord, swearing it, must look the least of them in the face while he does. The third lamp, the turning place my son had memorized off an almanac, is where the new Lord turns to face the common rope and speaks the oath to the smallest, nearest face he can find. Edry Fenn had known that. She had not given my son a good seat. She had given him the place where the Lord must look while he swore to keep the house's word to the least of those it is given to, set a dying child in the exact spot where the whole meaning of the morning came to rest, and then set Aldous Wren in front of him, so the meaning could not be moved. The young lord came down the chapel steps and up the lamp walk slowly in the cold, and he did not go to Lord Hask, though Lord Hask plainly expected it and half lifted a hand. He walked past the creditor of his house as though the man were a lamp post, and came to the third lamp, to the wide pale circle of warm light, and stopped in front of my son's chair and looked down at Davin, and Davin looked up at him, and for a moment neither said anything at all. Then the young lord went down on one knee on the cold stone in his dark plain coat in front of the whole court so that his face was level with my son's face, and he said, "You're in my turning place." And Davin, who was braver than I will ever be, said in his small cracked voice, "I know, I'm sorry, they gave it to me." And the young lord said, "I know they did, the almonry seal, 11 weeks ago, I countersigned it." I had not known that the new lord himself, before he was lord, had put his own hand to the order that gave my son the third lamp. But he had. He said so, kneeling there. And I understood then that the morning had been decided long before Lord Hask came up the river road, decided in a quiet room in the autumn by a young man who would soon take an oath and meant to be able to keep it, and that everything since dawn had only been the great creditor discovering, one immovable man at a time, that the morning was not for sale. The young lord stood and turned to Lord Hask, and he was not angry and he was not afraid, and that the absence of both was the most frightening thing about him, because Lord Hask had weapons for anger and weapons for fear, and none at all for a man who had simply decided. "My Lord Hask," the young lord said, "I am told you have promised to call the dead of this house at noon if that child keeps his place." "I have," said Lord Hask. "And I will. You may keep your sentiment or you may keep your house, my lord. You cannot keep both." "Then call it," said the young lord. The court did not breathe. "Call it at noon," the young lord said, "and I will meet you in the steward's hall with the books, and it will be paid every coin by the sale of whatever must be sold, the lamps, the plate, the winter seat itself, the very stone of this court, until your ledger is clean and you are gone from this house forever with all your silver in your hands. You will be repaid. You have my word, which is the word of this house, and you have just spent a morning watching how this house keeps its word, so you know what it is worth." He paused. "But you will not move the boy. The debt buys the silver back. It does not buy the word. The word is not for sale today or ever, and a house that would sell it to keep its roof is a house already fallen and not worth the keeping. Send your man at noon, and stand out of the light. You are in the boy's place." I want to tell you that Lord Hask raged, because it would be a more satisfying thing to tell. He did not. He stood very still in the heart of the light, a man who had brought the largest weapon in the world to a cold morning and found it would not fire, because the people in front of him had each, in turn, the footman, the almoner, the guardsman, the steward who came to betray them and could not, and last the young lord, refused to value the thing he threatened above the thing he could not buy. A threat is only as strong as the fear it finds. He had found a whole house with no fear in it of the right kind, and his threat had nowhere to land. He inclined his head, a small precise motion, the bow of a man acknowledging a closed account. "At noon, then," he said, "in the steward's hall," and he stepped out of the lamp circle, out of the light, back down the cleared lane toward the river gate, past Aldous Wren, who did not give him a glance, who looked, the whole time, only at the gate and the morning he was keeping, and he was gone. The young lord took the oath. He took it the way the old order says it must be taken, at the third lamp in the heart of the light, turned to face the common rope, speaking the words to the nearest, smallest face he could find. And the nearest, smallest face was my son's. So the new lord of the house of Caraway swore the founding oath of his whole house, to keep its word to the least of those it is given to, before the great against the great, though it cost him, with his eyes on Davin and Davin's eyes on him, and it was the truest taking of that oath the court had ever seen, because the court had just watched him mean every word of it before he said one. The choir sang. The 1,000 lamps burned down the long court. And my son, who had come only to see a man go by close enough to touch the cold off his cloak, had a lord of a great house swear the oldest oath of the land directly into his eyes, with his name already read aloud and lodged in the muniments of the house. I have to tell you the rest plainly, because the morning was the great thing and everything after is smaller, but you will want to know it. At noon the steward's hall was opened, the books were brought, and Lord Hask's man came, but Lord Hask did not call the debt. I have wondered why for 5 years. Perhaps a creditor who pulls down a house gets his silver and never lends again, while one owed by a house that keeps its word against him gets his silver and a name worth more than silver, and Lord Hask, whatever else he was, could do that sum too. Or perhaps a man can stand in the cold and watch a footman, an almoner, a guardsman, a steward, and a young lord each refuse in turn, to be afraid of him over a sick boy's chair, and come away changed in a small place he did not know he had. I do not know. I know the debt was not called that day or after, and that the winter seat of the house of Caraway stands on its hill above the river still, and the lamps are hung on the founding morning every year. Edry Fenn came to the hospice that evening with a flask of warm broth and sat by my son, and let him tell her the whole morning back to her, every lamp, the kneeling Lord, the words read off the parchment, and she listened as though she had not been standing 8 feet away for all of it, which is the rarest kind of kindness there is. Davin lived 2 years more, longer than the level-voiced doctors had thought he would, though I will not pretend the morning is why. I only know that a boy with something to remember holds on differently than a boy with nothing. He kept, until the end, the small thing the guardsman had given him. For Aldous Wren did give him a thing, after all, though he gave it the way he did everything, without fuss and almost without motion. When the oath was taken and the press of great folk swept toward the river gate, the old guardsman stood his post until the relief came at the changing of the watch, and then, off duty, his rifle handed on, his post properly kept and passed, he walked back up the cleared lane to the third lamp, where my son still sat too tired now to do anything but watch the lamps. And Aldous Wren stopped in front of the chair and came down, not to one knee the way the Lord had, but to a slow crouch, an old man's careful folding down, so his face was level with my son's, and took off one white glove and held out his bare hand and said, "You held your place, soldier. So did I, that's the whole of the work." And my son put his small hand into the old guardsman's bare one, and they shook hands, the oldest man at the gate and the smallest face at the rope, the two who had not moved. That is the thing my son kept, not the Lord, though the Lord was a kind and a good man, the guardsman's bare hand and the 11 words, "You held your place, so did I, that's the whole of the work." Davin asked me to write it on the card that went with him, at the end, and I did, and it is there still on the hill above the river, a stone's throw from the gate Aldous Wren kept for 31 years. I have told you I never found the bottom of what the guardsman did that morning, but I have found this much. The powerful believe everything is for sale because everything in their world has always been for sale. They have never come up against the one kind of thing that is not, and so they bring their money and their debts and their heavy names to a cold morning expecting the world to bend, as it always has. And the whole of a house's honor, the whole of any honor is whether, somewhere along the line of its gates, there stands one man whose entire trained art is the refusal to bend, who will keep the word the house gave to the least of those it was given to, though it cost him, because keeping it is the post. There was such a man at the river gate at Maldering. He did not move my son, and because he did not move, the whole house behind him, one frightened person at a time, found that it could not move either, and remembered on a cold founding morning what it was. That is the whole of the work, and the smallest face at the rope was the one who got to see it done.